Good morning.
Good morning.
There's an interesting dilemma that came up today a little bit in class. The question was posed, and it's a good question. And there's a variety of answers you can give. And it has to do with why do so many monks, of course this is a perception thing, why do so many monks get into trouble with ego problems about their perception of who they are? Which could lead into why do so many monks do things that are inappropriate? And I think one goes hand in hand with the other. Of course, that's our perception because we practice within a Buddhist world, so it looks like lots of bad stuff is going on with monks, and or just monks are just really, really full of themselves. There's one local, and there's more than one, so I don't even know what his name is. I've never met him, but apparently he's considers himself to be very important. And I met a fellow who came here a few times, and he talked about his experience with him and the way he was treated. So how does that take place? Well, I think it's very, very difficult for human beings not to believe their own press. And I think it's very difficult for human beings when they're treated as special not to start thinking of themselves as being special. Now that doesn't mean there aren't special people. There certainly are special people, but usually the real special people don't ever think of themselves as being special. And I think we have a wonderful example of that now with the new Pope that the Catholics have. And he does not think of himself as being special. He thinks of his job as being special. And he thinks of the things that he needs to do as being special, but for himself, he does not see himself as being terribly special. So it's a very intricate thing. It's like I frequently mention the fact that the monk Lin Chi, I always admired him because he signed every communication that he wrote as the monk of no rank. And I think that's so important. You know, typically within Buddhism, when somebody, quote, becomes special, it's usually because they become old. And most of the time, they're totally conscious of the fact that the only reason why everybody's making a big fuss about them is because they become old. And we have a practical hierarchy that I don't think all the different, well, first of all, I think that the #1 school in America is the Japanese schools. This is what Americans have been exposed to. We had some visitors that stayed a few days at the temple here a couple months ago, and we were talking, and it was a husband and wife. And she commented, we were kind of talking about this, and she commented that she felt that the prevalent school in America was the Tibetan school. And that surprised me. And I said, why do you say that? And she says, well, you know, because I meet so many people, if you ask them about their Buddhism, they will tell you they're a Tibetan Buddhist. And I said, oh, okay. And I saw the opportunity for a disagreement. So I let it go by, but yeah, I think that there's a great visibility for Tibetan Buddhism. We have all these movie stars. And so they're very visible and they get a lot of press. And when I used to go to the prison, the favorite author for the prisoners to read was the Dalai Lama. Because the Dalai Lama writes a lot about being peace and being peaceful. And he talks about, because people would say to him, aren't you angry because you got kicked out of Tibet, etc., etc. And he would go, no, that's not the way to approach that. Well, you know what? Any monk should be able to say that. Aren't you angry about? And the monk should be able to say, well, that's something I have to overcome, or that's something I have to deal with, is this whole business of anger. And the Japanese, only the Japanese could make a precept of not becoming angry, because it's such an incredibly human emotion to become angry. Only the Japanese, and they probably come pretty close to pulling it off. They also come up pretty close to having no emotions. So, is that what the Buddha had emotions? Because the Buddha cared about his disciples, and he cared about what happened to his disciples. But we have almost this mask, the no mask, I think was inspired in Japan by the notion of we cannot show any emotions. Therefore, if we don't show the emotion, we don't have it. I don't think any psychiatrist would agree with that. They would say, no, you're just hiding behind that mask. So, we have this hierarchy. I went off on these two different schools because the hierarchy is pretty apparent with Tibetan Buddhism, because you can tell those guys because they're wearing funny hats, and lots of people are bowing to them. And I think America is familiar with that. I remember when the Dalai Lama came here. It was interesting because his first trip here, he went to the Vietnamese temple in Los Angeles. And so some of us were just marching along, here we are in another procession, and there's a new monk. Actually, I was in front of him. And I should have pictures of that to show how important I am, because I was in front of the Dalai Lama. And the reason I was in front of the Dalai Lama is, the big horns that Tibetans use, those big, huge things. Okay, I carried the front of the horn. And my friend who always complained, his Buddhist name should be one who always complained, was back there blowing the horn. And he thought that was such an imposition upon himself that he actually had to walk and blow a horn. And in reality, we would stop. We had a signal set up, and we'd walk a little ways, and we'd stop, and he'd go, whoa. And then when he was done doing that, then I would nod my head, and we'd walk a little bit along and catch up to everybody else in the parade. There were flags in front of us, so we weren't actually the very front, because the flags were actually honoring us, who was blowing the horn, and nobody else mattered in that procession. But you see that hierarchy in there. Eric went and got to visit with the Karmapa when he was on one of his many world tours of Buddhist countries. And he got to see the Karmapa, who is, this go-around, is just a kid. How old is he, Eric?
26.
26. Yeah. Just barely old enough. Technically in Buddhism, you can't even take a disciple because he's too young. He has to be at least 30. So, but he got to see him. And the Karmapa is really important in Tibetan Buddhism because they are almost in charge. The Mongolians picked the Dalai Lama instead of the Karmapa. If the Dalai Lama had done something wrong at that moment, then the Mongolians would have picked, because they were vying for being the #1 monk in Tibet. But with Japanese Buddhism, all we know is that, there are lots of famous monks, and of course they were really, really important, and they were enlightened, and therefore, but what about all the other guys? Is there any kind of pecking order? It isn't always apparent, except maybe somebody has a fancier robe and all of this. The pecking order is very, very simple in Buddhism. And it's supposed to be the same pecking order no matter what country it comes from, what tradition it is. It doesn't matter whether it's Pure Land or Zen or any of that sort of stuff. How long have you been a monk? That's the pecking order. So the oldest monk, and we don't care what their chronological age. We have a fellow out in Adelanto who's pretty young as a monk, but he's pretty old as a human being. But he's still young. And so the most common thing that happens when you visit a Buddhist country is they ask you, how long have you been a monk? And I never can remember, there's a name for it. They ask you your such and such name. We say Dharma age. That's very self-explanatory. What is your Dharma age? And so a monk will reply, 32. And you look at him and he's Chuck's age. And you go, wait a minute, you're not 32. Well, yes, as a monk he's 32. And so why is that important? Well, it keeps the arguing down, because there really is no difference between children and adults. Okay, the children are just more sophisticated at getting what they want. The adults are more just, they're loud and aggressive and pushy, that's all. So where do we sit? Well, we find out. If you go to a temple as a monk, one of the first things they'll ask you is how old you are. And then that tells them where you get to sit. And it has nothing to do with being important. It just simply has to do with courtesy. You know, remember that old idea that if you're on a bus and a woman came on the bus, you'd stand up and let her sit down? It's just courtesy. Why did we do this? Well, maybe she was carrying groceries. Maybe this and that. It's a very old custom. So we have that. So importance simply becomes a matter of age. It stops being a matter of attainment. When I went to study with Thich Thien Nhat, there were a couple interesting notions I had. One was that the Japanese typically never talk about enlightenment. In other words, you know, Mary, she's had a number of kenchos. Soon she will qualify as a living Buddha. No, the Japanese never talk about that. Now, the students very often go, I really think the old master is enlightened. But they don't usually say it very loud. There's a kind of a taboo in there. I went to study with a Vietnamese master that said the word of enlightenment, it's just as you would say, I think I'll have some bean soup. And by the way, did you see that enlightened person that was at the temple? He called someone enlightened. But what he never did was he never said, did you see that deluded person at the temple? One of the things that I found extraordinary, trying to weave my way between the Japanese and the Vietnamese tradition, was that, and the Vietnamese share many, many habits and traditions with the Chinese, is one is never judged by attainment. One is never judged by attainment. One is always treated a certain way because of their Dharma age. So that if we have a really, really old monk, we need to be nice to him. And if we have a really, really young monk, we can send them, you know, to go do the chores because they're young. And it's a very practical thing. It's like telling your grandma to go unload the truck. You know, why would you do that? No, you would look around for a kid or a couple of kids. I have been introduced, Mary's husband introduced me to a marvelous practice, which I promise to practice for the rest of my life. When I go to Lowe's or Home Depot and I have big heavy stuff to load in the truck, I go up to the counter and I say, I cannot lift things. That's exactly what I said. I cannot lift things. I let them take a look at me and I say, I need a couple of young men to load the truck full of drywall. And they don't even blink. They have really good manners. And somebody told me, well, that's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. That's why that's what's supposed to bring you back to these stores, is that they help you with stuff like that. It's just that every time I look in the mirror, I don't see an old man, so I get confused. I'm not confused when I try to load a truck full of drywall, though. And I know exactly who I am. So, I've done that now 3 times. And it works every time. Hello, I need to buy 2 big doors. We're talking about fully mounted doors and everything, and I need someone to load them for me. Doesn't blink. Lady behind the counter doesn't blink. She said, let me get somebody for you. Out comes 2 nice men who, when they get them all loaded up, they say, is there anything else you need? We'd be here. Well, I'll come back. And yeah, I did the first time. I said, well, I'll come back and I'll get that stuff, because it wasn't very big. Oh no, we're happy to do it. And we went around and we got 3 2x4s and a box of nails and stuff like this. And then they took them out and loaded them in the truck for me. It's all a matter of age. We used to know how to be nice to people who are old. We've kind of forgotten that in this country, and unfortunately I've heard that they're forgetting that in Europe. Matter of fact, I've heard that in the world they're starting to forget that. And I think they're emulating one of the worst habits we have, which is only think of ourselves. Never pay attention to other people around us. So, but this is what we have in Buddhism. I went to a ceremony, which is called the plenary mass. I have no idea what it's called in Vietnamese or any other language, but that's what American scholars, Western scholars typically call it. And essentially what you do is you pray for the dead. And it starts in the afternoon and it goes on into the dark, and you're reading the Lotus Sutra most of the time. But it goes on forever and ever. They have a pitcher of water and they have limes to suck on you, because you get so dry just reciting this stuff. And I remember the first time I went to this ceremony, and the abbot, who not only was the abbot, was not only old, but he was quite a scholar and a poet, and the number 2 guy in charge of what was going on. We sat around a table out in the courtyard of the temple. And the number 2 guy was a really sweet guy, and I'll bet you he had an IQ all of about 70. And the abbot, about 2 hours into this, because he was having a horrible time reading, but I didn't tell you, they read out of Chinese characters. These are Vietnamese reading classical Chinese. And he turned to me and he said, he's the next oldest, because he was having such a hard time. But the head monk at a temple is typically not picked because they're talented. We have to pick the next oldest. And sometimes that means that everybody else should be doing what? Helping him. There's the lesson. The monks that are more talented should be helping. They shouldn't be standing back, because this is what we do in this country. I should have that job, because I'm better at doing that, instead of thinking, well, he's missing things, so let's step in and make sure they get done. But never draw attention to ourselves in the process of doing that. It's a difficult thing. We live in a very, very competitive society, where people get confused and think titles mean something. One of my all-time favorite stories, and I have to say this out loud, because maybe somebody will hear this and they'll knock on my door in a year and say, I'm here, is that we have all of these talks on the web, assuming we haven't lost them. That happened one time. But we have all of these talks on the web. And my life would be a lot easier if somebody would go through. Can you imagine listening to all those talks? Which, oh God, you'd have to truly be a masochist to want to listen to all those talks. But it would be nice to know, because I've only listened to 1/2 of a talk. The very first talk we put on the web, I listened to the first 20 minutes of it. You know, if they listened to it on the web, they'd say, I listened to your talk about blah on the web. And I'd say, well, how was it? And then they looked like, you know, the deer in the headlight type of thing, because they didn't want to tell me that it was really not very good. I go, no, I'm really curious. You know, if it wasn't any good, let me know. We can take it off. You know, that's easy. That's a click of a mouse to get rid of bad talks. And they'd go, well, no, actually, I enjoyed it quite a bit. But of course, here we are with this ego thing again. You know, he must. If I was singing a song and I said to Mary, how did I do? I'm really asking Mary how I did. She can make it soft when she tells me that it stunk, but I'm really asking her how I did, because why ask otherwise? So what I really need is somebody who doesn't have a life, who would like to sit and listen to all those talks and jot down what they were about, and then jot down what Zen story that I used or Zen koan to get it going, because I know too many years have gone by. First of all, I repeat myself all the time, so I know I do that. And then when the talks, because the story, a little Zen story, is very famous that I want to tell you. It's about a monk and his disciple, his attendant. And they're walking along a road, and it's starting to get dark. And so the master says to the disciple, I think we need to pull over the side of the road and make a little camp, and just maybe this is where we need to sleep. And so the attendant says, well, master, we didn't eat any lunch, so I'll make some lunch, breaking the old-fashioned monk's rules, but not. The Theravadins today think you'd be breaking a rule. The Theravada rule actually is, if you are traveling, you can eat at any time when you stop. That's really what the rule is. But they got so fixated on, oh, I have to eat before noon, or I can't eat for the rest of the day. Wrong. If you're traveling, you can eat when you stop. So the monk and the master pull over. Now this is a Zen monk, and he's not looking too special. They've been traveling a lot. The robes are dirty. They're black, by the way. So, and it looks like they've been out for a long time. And here coming in the other direction is another monk. And he's got very elaborate robes on. And his attendant looks very, very proud of his master, and they stop and they say, do you mind if we stay overnight here with you and share your fire? And the monks, of course, say, no, that's fine, please, share our space. There was a little stream where they could get some water. So time goes by and they have their dinner and they kind of share their food and everything. And so the monk, he belonged to a different school. He said to the little Zen disciple, who was pretty raggedy looking, he said to him, he says, my master is very important. And the Zen disciple said, oh, really? He said, yes, he's very important. He's like a patriarch. Oh, that's wonderful for you. He says, yes, he can do all kinds of wonderful things. He can tell the future. He can divine the past that people don't know. He can levitate off the ground. He can go weeks without ever eating. And the little Zen monk's going, oh, wonderful, oh, wonderful. Oh, you must be very proud. So finally the monk says to the little Zen monk, he says, so what can your teacher do? And the Zen monk says, nothing very special. When he's hungry, he eats. When his bladder is full, he relieves himself. And when he's tired, he lays down and sleeps.